Up on the website. I brought about 10 copies in case anybody desperately needs to see it in paper. I wasn't sure if anybody would or not, but I've got 5 each, and anybody who wants to snag one is welcome to do it. I very much appreciated the invitation that Chris and his very able crew rendered to me to be here at this intergalactic mind meld, where we all work very hard, but in 15-minute increments. I was concerned because one of the key elements of the meeting was sort of to fill in the blanks. We've been using a rough and ready list of civilizations that David Wilkinson created. The earliest version that I could find was 1982, but they're the same 13 that we've sort of been dealing with. They're the same 13 that were in the document that everybody got, saying here's what we're looking at, here are the political interaction networks that we're looking at, and maybe we ought to figure out sort of how to move forward with some of these. I'm not a historian or an anthropologist. I'm a political scientist. All we ever do is current events. It gets kind of boring. I thought, well, okay, I needed a new topic, something interesting. So I looked for the most question marks on the list. And I thought wherever those were, the bar had to be pretty low. And I would see if I could do some intellectual ground clearing there. There is an Irish civilization, number 13. I thought, well, that's interesting. I mean, frankly, I've always thought it kind of enigmatic. Ireland's about the size of the U.S. state of South Carolina, a very proud culture, a fantastic diaspora people. But a civilization, especially by David's own criteria, which he sticks to, I wasn't so sure. So I decided I would try very hard to find out, report my findings to you. My desire was that my paper be so bad that real experts be so incensed that they would come and correct us, and then we'd have knowledge. So I looked at a prestige good network as created by the Irish states and state systems. I considered engulfment, and then I looked at the question of civilizational status. I was very pleased and rather surprised to find a very early prestige goods network from about 2500 BCE, at least locally. The Atlantic facade is the name, I guess, that they give to this particular area. This is Chris Christensen's conceptualization of it. Dense local interaction and some interaction outside this area. And the Irish are a fairly important part, not an early part, but an important part of this network. 2500 BCE is when we know for a fact that the Irish started working with gold from Wales, because some very smart chemist last year published a mechanism or method by which we can trace the geological origins of gold. Okay? And many of the Irish gold artifacts ended up coming from ore mined in Cornwall. In fact, the Cornwall mines were not gold mines, they were tin mines, tins being so vital to the making of bronze. And so the assumption is that the Irish probably were importing tin as well. The Irish started to produce interesting goods and export those goods. A lot of those were, interestingly enough, elite goods. And so, for example, Irish cauldrons, which are elite goods, they're great, great big pots basically for feasting. They began to make their way through the system. The Irish were identified, those are cauldron finds. Okay, more or less 9th and 8th centuries, although I have no idea how Christensen decided that. But those are cauldron finds basically in hoards, and it's all over that Atlantic facade. The Irish started using motifs in their own art that came from as far away as the Eastern Mediterranean, burial practices from Hungary, a variety of interesting things. I think the link between the Irish and Central civilization probably runs as early as 1500 BCE, is certainly secure based on the evidence that we have by 1000 BCE. And so I stood corrected. I should have trusted David. that the Irish were indeed part of it. Then I turned to the question of the development of a state system. And then I started to run into a lot of trouble. Because Irish society was very small, very scattered, and very rural. And this is very hard to derive from the literature. So I started reading, and Irish historiography actually has a name for the historical writings of the period, say, in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th century. They call it synthetic history. It's simply a history written that is commissioned by and written for a ruler who wants to give the impression that his family has always ruled an area and ruled it well. Okay? Now, this did not shock me in particular. It would shock me if this isn't going on, actually. But what was so amazing about it was that they seemed to be proud of it, gave it a name, and would peddle, quite literally, these histories written over and over again, and simply change the name of the clan, okay, in various parts. So you can read the exact same history, except somebody else or somebody new where the territory perhaps had changed, okay, proving that you've always been a coherent leader of a coherent region in a coherent way with a great retinue and to great popular acclaim. Okay? As best I could tell, the leaders were far better at supporting historians in this effort than they were in controlling, okay, any actual realm. And so we begin to cross-check our histories, and what we find is very little. Okay? Very little differentiation. No particular evidence of the creation of specialized retinues, no fortifications to hold actual fixed territory. We find sets of laws and norms that militate against the creation of states or state systems. If one clan goes to war with another clan, you fight only until the king dies. Then everybody stops. The victor can go home and tell everybody they won. But they cannot replace the old clan leader. The clan chooses its own new leader. They cannot claim clan territory. Right? There is no consolidation in this system. Okay? And states simply don't form. Kings themselves were primus inter pares rulers. There were no special kingly lands. If you were king, you had your own lands. When you died, your son got your lands, and the new king had his own lands. So we're not really looking at great states or state systems. And I had a lot of trouble going through the literature trying to figure out when a state system may have even emerged. I'm going to use a wild-ass guess, I really am, and say 650. Because I begin to see large marcher areas, and I can't imagine them being successful without some state affect. But honestly, I couldn't find them in the literature. I keep looking. Right? I also found no cities, no urban agglomerations. Vital, certainly for David's definition of civilization. Our meetings suggest 20,000 as a minimum. I find nothing like that in Ireland at all. Barrow does suggest that one Irish city approaches that number, but when I read further, I discovered it was a town with a large university, a large cathedral, and a large university. And he derived the population estimate by listening to discussions of how many foreign students were in the town. And it was suggested that those estimates were false, were created by the people who ran the university to try and get other foreign students to matriculate as well. Okay? It's sort of the Bronze Age analog to the campus tour. Okay, is what we're dealing with here. So I find no cities at all. And then I find a loss of autonomy. Okay? The Vikings show up in 795, and they settle permanently in the 830s. And they were devastating. Okay? Truly devastating. They attacked monastic life most of all, because monasteries were the safety deposit banks of their day. The Irish, by the way, also attacked their own monasteries, but the Irish wouldn't kill as many people, and the Irish wouldn't take holy relics. The Vikings did. So many of the monasteries were never rebuilt. Historical documents were destroyed. The literate population was slaughtered. The Vikings actually took Ireland a great step backwards, and fairly populous as well. This, with any luck, these are Viking incursions from about 850. I can't see that at all. They're all over the place. Everything on there is an attack either on a monastery or a town, or it's a battle in defense of a monastery or a town. Okay? Ireland was going backwards in many civilizational attributes as a result of this. The Vikings did help create a new system in Ireland, because as Irish norms with regard to war weren't followed by the Vikings, pretty soon the Irish didn't follow them either. And so now we get some organizations beginning to roll up other smaller clans and consolidate and try and make a specialization, okay, in the means of social or political violence, etc. And so we have some of that. We also have urbanization under the Vikings, but that's because the Vikings founded cities, not the Irish. Dublin was a Viking city. Wexford, Cork, Limerick, those were all Viking cities. Whatever nucleation might have emerged, and that's the debate, I guess, in urban studies, nucleation around monasteries, very rarely took off, because they were, of course, the targets of all this violence. Now, I know Wilkinson knows all of this, because it's actually in his discussions. He usually takes definitions very seriously, because if you're going to count civilizations, you have to know what they are. I've seen him torture his definitions on occasion. I'd never seen him assassinate a definition. And so I wondered how the Irish ended up on the list. Then I found a paper he wrote in 1995 called Missing Civilizations, right, where he takes on the question, what do we do with all the almost civilizations? Right? I mean, Toynbee calls them abortive, and other words that are not very nice. The best term he uses, I think, are unlucky. It means they don't, well, you know, I mean, they're missing a key element, or they don't quite make it, or they're attacked by someone too early. It's just a mess. And my sense from that 1995 paper was that David wanted to put the Irish on almost as a surrogate for all of the almost civilizations that just didn't make it, that we should not forget about. Okay? These are not barbarian empires, these are advanced systems. How are we going to deal with these? Probably not by creating a bevy of new categoricals. And so he left the Irish on. I was convinced I was correct when I discovered that that paper had been delivered in Dublin. Right? Then I knew I was on the right path.
Actually, you should have been deconvinced, because the Irish would not appreciate a paper which said you were almost civilized.
Civilized, that's right, that's true. Yeah, it could be taken the wrong way. No, you're right. In any event, I fear it probably makes more sense to consider the Irish from the perspective of the literature that Tom Hall talks about, the perspective of the literature of incorporation. Though obviously not of migratory peoples, but not of a civilization either. And I thought about pursuing then the rest of my research, the rest of the paper for this presentation from that perspective. But I decided against it. I decided instead that since it was the Vikings who broke the civilizational back of the Irish, I wondered if maybe we shouldn't attend to the Scandinavians just a bit and see whether we should be paying attention. Let's see. No, that didn't do it. There. To what they were doing. Sure enough, I find a relatively early prestige goods network, not quite as early as the Irish, but 1500 BCE, shortly, yes, 3 minutes. Okay, we're going back and forth to Italy for prestige goods. We are clearly linked to Central Civilization by 1000. They're trading well-bred cattle, they're trading amber, they're trading in mercenaries, ornaments, weapons, they're getting bronze, they're getting wagons. This is a fairly advanced prestige goods network. States as well, fairly advanced, in part because of the interaction of Scandinavia with Rome. Okay? The Germanic tribes destroyed 3 Roman legions. And so Rome had to resort to diplomacy, which they did, building up local rulers, enhancing further the prestige goods network, helping to create states. And I do see in that literature tremendous social differentiation, specialization, full-time leaders with retinues, armories. You don't bring your own weapons to war. You fight for me, I provide the weapons. Taxes, public works, large-scale canals, a territory, probably by about the 5th century, obviously and securely by about 750. Urbanization as well. Cities around 20,000, the historic capital of Denmark, which I can't pronounce, I'm sure it's in here somewhere. Also in the east, along the eastern empire of the Vikings, cities of 20,000, and extensive reach. Okay, let's see. Most of what we hear about in the West are the Western Vikings. Okay, how they went all the way around, and then they got to England. We don't even talk about Ireland. Then they went to Iceland. We don't say what they did there. It wasn't very nice. Then they went to Greenland. Then they went to Newfoundland, and then we study somebody else. No, they went south. Okay, extensively raiding and trading through the Straits of Gibraltar. They sacked the city of Pisa, okay, and then head down as well into the area controlled by Byzantium. But the more interesting thing is what happens when they go the other way. This we don't pay attention to at all. The red lines are Viking lines of raiding, but more often in this part of the world trading, down all the riverine systems, all the way to Byzantium. Okay, I should use the pointer, I know. They actually hold the city, they besiege the city. They get tremendous treasure as a result. The Byzantine Imperial Guard is a Viking Imperial Guard. They continue south, and I can track them as far as Egypt. They've circumnavigated Europe. Okay? Now, the Mongols don't appear on David's list because they're very ephemeral. An overextended semi-peripheral marcher state. Nothing ever goes home to the Mongols. Okay? Batu stayed in the east. He was actually invited back to take his grandfather's throne. He did not. Hulagu goes south, converts to Islam, never returns home. Kublai becomes a Chinese emperor, never returns home. I understand why they're not on the list. But for Scandinavians, okay, this treasure goes home. Okay? It changes, it facilitates early state formation. It changes the nature of social relations. It enhances their ability to then engage in activities in other places. The captain of the Byzantine Imperial Guard takes his retinue and his treasure, goes home and rules Norway as king for 20 years. Okay? So we're not dealing with an operation like the Mongols here. We really are talking about a fairly organized system. 2 questions I cannot yet answer. First, how well integrated was this? The literature keeps telling me, oh, it was very well integrated. Things that happen in one part of the Scandinavian world, the Viking world, reflect throughout. But except for a few stories, I can't substantiate that. I continue to work on it. And then, of course, when do we come into systematic contact with central civilization? Okay. For the same reason, I can't yet answer that, because I don't know whether I'm dealing with independent units from Scandinavia or actual members of a tightly knit Scandinavian network. And so that is the research I will take up next.